Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the Centre for inviting me. I'm really privileged to be here and thank you for coming. I'm hoping that this is going to be quite an informal chat, an entertaining one as well. A lot of people, when they find out what I do, they say, "Oh, that must be really interesting." And I say, "Yeah, it is really interesting, but it's also really depressing as well, because of the sorts of things that I see and the stories that I hear, and also because, as a Muslim woman myself, I can identify with a lot of things that I'm hearing and seeing on the ground. So it's interesting, it's fascinating, but there's also areas for reflection and things that just I think are quite sad, really. So I want to just basically, I'm going to whiz through a lot of things. So just start with, so while creating husbands, God promised women that good and ideal husbands would be found in all corners of the world. This is a little joke that someone sent me. And then he made the earth round. And for lots of women, this is sort of exemplifies the problems that they have had in trying to find a matrimonial partner. So this is just, I think, just a nice, neat way to enter into this. And these ads were on the London Tube network quite recently from Muzmatch, one of the matrimonial agencies that specialises in using the app, using mobile apps to find marital partners. So I've had some interesting conversations with the originator of that, Shazad Yunus. So why research on British Muslim relationships? What brought me here? And I always like to kind of start with this sort of bit of a biographical intro into this. So many years ago, when I was doing my doctorate, it was on Muslim women in higher education and looking at their motivations and experiences for going into higher education and the impact it had on their identities in terms of religious and cultural identities. And one of the things that I found in that during the research was that one of the key motivating factors that lots of women spoke about from their parents' side was that if they have a degree, they'll get a good quality husband. However, having spoken to some of those women in the years to follow and other women who have had higher education experiences, they've kind of realised that that husband hasn't materialised, he hasn't been there, he hasn't been around. So what they've found is that, while we've seen, and the figures show this as well in terms of entry into higher education, there's been a rapid professionalisation amongst British Muslim women. The numbers of Muslim women entering into higher education are higher than men. There has been a lack of compatible Muslim men for marriage, or women, or men that women feel are compatible to them, not just in terms of education, but in terms of emotional maturity. So there'll be a quote that I'll highlight a little bit later on, which sort of exemplifies some of that. But so women have found that, when men go and get a degree, they come away with the degree and the qualifications, but they don't have the kind of the emotional savvy, the emotional sort of know-how, the ability to connect that they're looking for. So there is a disparity there, as well as various other areas that they feel they're disadvantaged by. So in terms of some framings and context for this work, we all know that Muslims as a group, as a social grouping, are objectified. They're objectified in media discourses, in policy discourses, but they're also objectified within academic discourses as well. And sometimes some of the things that I see get written about Muslims just make me wonder why there's always this sort of focus on what Muslims do in every sphere of their lives. And I have to say that I kind of have questions a lot of the time from the media. Whenever we were talking about Shamima Begum before we started the session, and I've actually made a policy of not engaging with the media whenever they call about ISIS brides or anything to do with terrorism. I'm probably one of the few academics who study Muslims in the UK who is not interested in forced marriages. I'm not interested in domestic violence, in female genital mutilation, in terrorism. I'm interested in everyday life experiences that affect the vast majority of Muslims, not the kind of the sort of high impact, high headline grabbing issues. So Prevent and Sharia has tended to frame some of the issues around Muslim personal relationships in certain ways. And a lot of the research that I've looked at and that I've been critical on families has had a largely Eurocentric approach, which has led to a pathologization of non-Euro family systems. And this is not just amongst Muslims as well. But when I have looked at studies on intimacy and Muslim families and Muslim relationships, again, the literature, the academic literature, is dominated by issues around forced marriages, domestic violence, honour-based violence, female genital mutilation or polygamy. And then when there are studies that are looking at sexual health and Muslims or Muslim women, it is always linked to sexual health needing to kind of have an impact on Muslim women in case there are issues linked to violence. So we can't seem to get away from these narratives of violence and bad things whenever we're talking about relationships and Muslims. So there tends to be this problematizing of Muslim marriages, and there is actually a project that is called that, which is based in the Netherlands, which is about, again, looking at things like polygamy and non-registration of marriages, all the sort of things that sort of seem to be framing Muslims in a certain way. So we don't have very much that is about the everyday lived experience, and that's what I'm interested in. So my field work has spanned over 15 years working with a particular Muslim marriage organisation called Muslim Marriage Events. And I go to lots of marriage events. I go as a participant observer, so I do a lot of ethnographic research. And so I go as a helper. So I help out at the sessions by trying to sort of help people meet each other. And I also disclose to everyone that I am an academic and I'm doing research in this particular issue. So I have a lot of informal conversations as well as a lot of in-depth, semi-structured interviews with British Muslim men and women, primarily more women than men, because women like to talk more than men do about these sorts of things. But I have had some interesting conversations with British Muslim men, and I'm trying to focus a bit more on that. So some of the key figures, just some facts, some basic demographics, in case you're not familiar with Muslim marriage events. And there are lots and lots of Muslim matrimonial organisations now. But this particular one has about 50,000 on the mailing list, around 10,000 on an online database. So they have an online service as well. And the ratio of women to men is about 55% to 45%. And they organise events according to ethnicity. So they have events for Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Arab, African, Caribbean, Somali converts. I forgot to put Indians. Interesting feature on this is that they have events for Indians and Pakistanis, but they have them separately on the same day because Pakistanis don't want to marry Indians, and Indians don't want to marry Pakistanis, and no one wants to marry Bangladeshis. So they have to have these events on separate days and cater for specific ethnic groups. What's interesting also is that a lot of the events that I go to are in London. They have events internationally as well as regionally. So when events are being held, say, in Manchester or in the Midlands, the demographics are slightly different. So the London-based ones can cater for a wide variety of ethnic groups, so they're much more diverse. The ones based from the Midlands onwards are much more Pakistani focused, but again, even there, the differentiation is even more stark because we have differences between Kashmiris not wanting to marry Mirpuris and vice versa. And interestingly, a lot of that is driven by second-generation British-born Muslim women who are mothers now of their kids and wanting to get them married and wanting to kind of preserve some kind of family line in terms of who they marry, who their children marry. So it's interesting that being British, being Muslim, rather than kind of diversifying out, there tends to be a closing in, which I think is quite interesting. They also cater for what they call practicing Muslims, which sort of puts some people off because they don't quite understand what practicing means. But they have events for those. And very often at the practicing Muslim events, we will find men attending who are looking for a second wife, i.e. a polygamous relationship. They have divorced and widowed events, which also have their own sets of dynamics. And I have to say, each one of these different ethnic groups as well, there are particular dynamics associated with each group, which again, are quite interesting to look at some point. So they have divorce and widowed events, and from their database, the organizer estimates that about 8,000 women are divorced, And of these, about just over, 5,500 are over 30 with or without children. So the divorced and widowed events happen again on the same day, because there's an assumption that divorced and widowed would be happy to marry each other. And sometimes they're held at the same time or at the same day as events that are catered for over 30s, because again the kind of the cohort is more likely to be groups that are slightly older. And I'll say something about the older groups in a little while. They also have events that are specifically geared for doctors, because again there is an issue around doctors, especially female doctors, finding Muslim partners. And again, this sort of goes against the grain of what we know or what we hear about Muslim families, and everyone wants, especially Asian families, they all want their children to become a doctor. But what happens when the daughters become doctors? They don't turn into they're not perceived as very good daughter-in-laws because of the working hours that they're obliged to keep. So there is a real problem around Muslim women who are doctors, and even within the doctor groups there are hierarchies. So GPs are at the bottom of the hierarchy, brain surgeons are at the top. Surgeons want to marry surgeons. No one wants to marry GPs unless they're other GPs. GPs won't marry any other medical professional. So people who are dentists, sometimes they'll do them with dentists and pharmacists. They can be seen as acceptable, but anybody else working in the medical field is not seen as doctor enough. So they have those sorts of events as well. They do have events for people with special needs, which they might hold once a year. And interestingly, in one event where they had a special needs event, there were two people who were deaf, and they married there and then. There happened to be an imam around, and so they had the marriage happen there and then. I don't know that was a few years ago, so I don't know what happened after that though. And they also have a number of free events. The free events are where anyone can turn up. They can preferably register, or they just turn up on the day. And usually these are events that cater for about 400 to 500 people, and they are huge and they are chaotic. So these are just some of the events they have. They have them internationally, I mentioned. So there was one that they had in Dallas. They've gone across other parts of the US. They go to in South Africa, in France, in the Netherlands. They also hold courses, and I've spoken at some of the courses to kind of give feedback on my research there. So they have quite a lot of events going on quite regularly. And the key question for me in this is, given that we know that the rapid commercialization of Muslim marriage, so you do a Google search, there will be hundreds of Muslim matrimonial organizations and sites, and Facebook will also kind of reveal loads and loads of different events looking at matrimony for British Muslims. Why, despite this plethora of ways to find people, are British Muslims still finding it so difficult to meet suitable British-born matrimonial partners? And we know that there is a problem with that, and I will exemplify some of that right now. And I talk about this in terms of a British Muslim crisis on various different levels. So, as I said at the beginning, there are increasing cohorts of British-born, degree-educated Muslim women who are in their 30s, 40s and 50s now, who are finding it difficult to marry and may never marry. There are a number of coaching organisations or coaches, Muslim coaches now, matrimonial coaches, which are geared towards supporting people, helping them kind of get into the right mindset so that they can find the one, with a promise of a kind, or an expectation that once someone has been through their course or their training, that they will be able to kind of suddenly meet the one for them. And I worry a little bit about that, because from what I see on the ground, I think there will be cohorts of men and women who will not marry, and some of them are being sold a false promise, I think. But that's an issue to look at. There's another issue, which is women often perceive themselves as being too educated and thus pricing themselves out of the marriage market. So we know that this is a phenomena. We had Simon Muhammad way back in 2012 writing an article in The Guardian, which she called the Muslim spinster crisis. And we've also had some academic articles, Ali Emtul and Shireen Hussain, talking about the myth of the happy celibate. So we know that there is an issue. We know there's a problem around women finding suitable matrimonial partners. We also know that there's an increase in marital breakdown. And again, that is an interesting thing to look at. But if we just kind of focus for a moment on this notion of the Muslim woman, the unmarried Muslim woman, single, celibate, getting older, and the article by Imtal Hussain, they highlight this unmarried older Muslim woman who are trapped between what they call negatively positioned choices, sex outside marriage on the one hand and celibacy on the other. And they say, do single Western Muslim women have an investment in maintaining the myth of the happy celibate because it allows them certain freedoms? Does performance of the happy celibate counteract suspicions of being soiled goods for long-term singles, thus keeping single women primed and ready for marriage? Is the promise of a good marriage the payoff for years of sexual denial, no matter how unlikely the prospect such a marriage may be? And that pretty much exemplifies what I've been saying about single women who may not marry. So I mentioned there's been an increase in marital breakdown. I've been kind of picking up on this for a number of years through conversations that I've had with representatives from Muslim women's organisations who have had support lines and phone calls, and a lot of the phone calls they'd be getting were about marital breakdown and where to go to for support and where to go to for divorce, etc. And that's a whole different area. But one of the things that we kind of been able to pick up just anecdotally is that we know that there's a lot of marital breakdown that happens excuse me, in the early years of marriage, so the first 2 years of marriage. And if we look at what we because of Muslim marriages, a lot of them are not registered, it's very difficult to know what the figures are in terms of marriage and divorce. What we can look at are sort of figures for single parent households and single households, and kind of make the links with religion. And the MCB did an analysis of the census, the most recent census data figures, and they found that the numbers of lone parent households are reaching similar levels to those of the wider UK population, around 42% at present. And that in itself probably says something. And we know that, like I say, formal divorces are kind of coming up to a par with the non-Muslim white population as well. But I say it's difficult to assess that because there's a non-registration of a proportion of Muslim marriages. And I think one of the things that we need to recognise in this is, again, the kind of the narrative has been, if Muslim marriages are not being registered, it's usually at the behest of the male or the in-laws to prevent the wife from claiming any rights as in a legal sense. But again, one of the things I've been picking up on the ground is that there's an agency, there's a Muslim female agency that's at play here, especially if Muslim women are in a financially strong position and they want to marry, but they're not entirely certain that the marriage is going to work out. So in order to protect their own assets, they are foregoing the civil ceremony, and they're the ones who are choosing not to have a civil marriage because they want to sort of see how the marriage goes, see how the relationship pans out, and also because they're fearful that their husband will make a claim on their income and on their assets. So we know that there's something going on. And again, this isn't something that is kind of documented in any particular way. There was a study that was done, the Channel 4 documentary that many of you might have seen, about undocumented Muslim marriages, and with the suggestion that perhaps 60% of marriages were unregistered. But again, even within that study, there was an acknowledgement that some of the drivers for that were Muslim women themselves. So the question that we can ask on this is, who is divorcing? Who is doing the divorcing? Is it men or is it women? What are the causes of divorce? If we're looking at this in maybe theoretical terms, trying to make the links with theory, is the individualization thesis that comes from Beck and Gersheim, is that something that is that is kind of coming into play into British Muslim relationships? And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment as well. So if we kind of look at some anecdotes in terms of the fieldwork at Muslim marriage events, they tend to be oversubscribed with women. This is not going to be a surprise to any of you, I imagine. So there are many in the 30s to 40s age cohort, and in terms of ratios, sometimes it's 3-to-1 for women and men, or 5-to-1. Recently, though, there has been, interestingly, and I don't quite know what's going on here, but men have started to outnumber women especially at the over 30s and divorced and widowed events, which is interesting. And I don't know whether this is just particular to this particular organisation or whether it is an issue around maybe men of that particular age group realising that they didn't actually find someone when they were when they were younger. But there does tend to be always a complacency amongst men. They're described by the organiser of these events as having a lastminute.com attitude. So where women will register very quickly for a matrimonial event, men will not, and they will often either turn up on the day or they will register very late and turn up. And sometimes we've had cases of men who come and get so scared that they will not attend the event, and the organisers had to find them in the toilets and drag them out. Sometimes what happens is that men will scan the room and see that there's no one to their liking and just not come, and just disappear. So we know that there are issues, there are dynamics at play which are not entirely chivalrous about behaviour in terms of attending events. We also know, because there's the catering for it, that there is an increased number of divorcees attending marriage events, and there are increasing numbers of men seeking second wives. So I got a little bit of there was an event in February, a free event. So there are about however many that ends up being, that figure there for men and women, 390 women attending, 370 men, which is quite a good turnout for men and women really. But the thing that I think was really interesting is the number of women who are over 40s. And I got tired counting the number of men in the other age categories, so I just stuck to the thing that I think was really significant. Look at the number of women in the over 40s, 181 attending and 97 men in the over 40s, and 4 of those were married already. So, and the numbers of divorced is kind of reasonably on a par. But I think that in itself is quite a significant figure for women who are over 40s and men who are in the same age category. And we know from the data, from the kind of the sort of the research and sort of the anecdotal stuff as well, that men who are in the age categories invariably don't want to marry a woman in the same age category, especially if she's in the 40s. So men who are in that 40 plus category are looking for women who are in their 30s at the very latest, because they want babies. And this is even if men are married and divorced with children, they want more babies. So it seems they want football teams. But I've come across men who are in their 60s attending events who again are looking for women in their 30s so they can have more children. So we know that there's an issue around that, and we know that women feel very discriminated and disadvantaged if they are in this age group or coming to the late 30s and realising that the men who are going to be in that age group, who they would normally sort of think is an acceptable age to marry them, are not looking at them. So that's an issue that we haven't really kind of got to grips with. So we know, and I'll go really quickly now, this is not just a problem that's restricted to Muslims. We know it's a global problem. We know that there are issues around women, educated women, professional women, not finding suitable partners worldwide. We know it's an issue in the Middle East. We know it's an issue in Japan, the kind of unfortunate term parasite singles. We know that it's a problem in Israel, so there's quite a lot of work done in Israel on single women. We know that there's, it's not an issue that's specifically focused on Muslims, but the thing that's specific about the Muslim experience is the issue of intimacy, and the fact that marital intimacy is reserved for marital relations. So, no sex outside marriage. And we don't talk about this because it's seen as a little bit embarrassing, but it's a fact. It's a feature that is significant, and because lots of Muslims, when they're socialised as children and as teenagers and then as adults, are segregated. There isn't a discourse. There isn't a sort of an acceptance of a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship. The only way they can have that relationship is through marriage, and when they're not getting that relationship, when they're not finding the partner, they're not having the opportunity to be able to have that sexual intimacy that they're entitled to. It raises a number of issues and a number of problems. So I think it's significant for Muslims in that they want to get married in order to be able to feel they can have a sexual relationship. It's not necessarily as an issue for people in the West, for instance, where the issue of not marrying can be seen as a choice. So So there's been so in terms of Muslims, there's been a change in discourse around arranged marriages to assisted marriages to the notion of an Islamic or a halal relationship. And this means different things to different people, but basically a halal relationship is one where people meet with the purpose of marriage and they meet up in a public place, so it's all sort of, and it kind of happens with very specific purposes in mind, and if there isn't a meeting of minds after 3 or 4 meetings, they part company and they start the search again. But people are also talking about wanting to fall in love. So they want love, but within halal relationship, within halal parameters. So there is a romanticized aspect to it as well. So I mentioned the rise in internet dating for Muslims, and there's a proliferation of online opportunities. But, what is the impact of these marriage apps? Are they good? Are they, are they kind of creating opportunities? Are they extending networks of romantic possibility? Or are they adding complication and stress? Is it a Pandora's box? Is it a case of too many choices and not being able to choose? Being in the sweetie shop and knowing that they're all my favourites, but I don't know which one to pick at the particular moment in time. What is the impact of Instagram and Facebook on marriage expectations, images of these perfect Muslim couples? Are they creating unrealistic expectations? We know, there's all sorts of, we've heard of couples who met on Instagram or via Facebook and they got married and they put their pictures up. And these are the kinds of images that the young Muslims are seeing. Beautiful couples, beautiful, happy images, all loved up and romantic. This is what they're all seeing, these beautiful images. What's the reality of that? It's quite limited. So I think, what I'm trying to say is that with the commercialization of marriage, the increase in the number of matrimonial events and websites, what it's actually done is it's led to increased confusion. It's led to an inability to decide. It's led to an increased level of superficiality and what I call a checklist mentality when it comes to searching for the partner, searching for the one. So basically, increased professionalization has led to a sense of increased individualization. And what young people are saying, not necessarily young people even, but what people are saying when they talk to me is that they want this, they want that. It's all about me and what I want from the relationship, and very little about what they can offer and what they can sort of bring into that relationship. And it links into parallels with Ulrich Beck and Elizabeth Beck-Gersheim's notion of individualization. And I know that is a problematic thesis, but I think there is an aspect that we need to kind of think about in terms of the ways people are conceiving about themselves and about their relationships and about the way they think about how they search for a partner, and also how they think about how they remain in a relationship. And we know that there's a shift from thinking about thinking about oneself in a marital couple as a we, to thinking about yourself as an I, and that has some impact in whether people stay together or decide to part ways. So intimacy is kind of been subjected to a digital transformation in many respects, and I think that the internet dating, searching is symptomatic of social and technological change that transforms matrimonial searching into a commodified game. So in terms of gendered realities and tensions, so a well-known community activist said to me that men can be professional in the workplace, but when they come home, they adopt a village mentality towards their wives, which I think is sort of very apt. And when I present this sort of comment, this quote at other events geared towards Muslims looking to get married, it seems to resonate a lot with women especially. And a woman I spoke to at an event, it was an Arab event, and she wasn't very impressed with the men that were there, and she said there weren't any men of her caliber at the event. And what she also added was that men are looking for wives and women are looking for companions. And again, I think this quote is great because it really just encapsulates the difference in expectations amongst men and women. And I did have some interesting quotes which I was going to put, but then I forgot. but I'll maybe get a chance to sort of read them out in a bit. But in terms of these gendered realities and tensions, from women's perspectives, they perceive that they've become too educated and that they're pricing themselves out of the marriage market. They perceive potentially compatible Muslim men as often seeking women who are at least 4 to 5, or in many respects 10 to 15 years younger, that men are seeking women who are not so academically or professionally accomplished. So again, that example of the female doctors is a particular example in relation to this, but also women who kind of have higher earning potentials than men are seen as perhaps not necessarily going to be good wives or good daughter-in-laws. Men are more likely and more willing to marry someone from back home in terms of their parents' country of origin, whereas women are not. And men are also more likely to marry outside religious and ethnic communities without social sanctions that women would face or may face. And they also feel that there's a lot of emphasis on appearance and looking a certain way. And again, as I mentioned, there are differing expectations in marriage between men and women, regardless of educational levels, especially around gender roles. So I want to kind of just highlight a quote that I have here. And there's a man who said to me, and I'll just read it out to you. He said, "All of us guys who attend these events have been brought up where mum was a housewife, dad was working, and it worked. But now it seems that of course women are getting educated and they must, it's their furs," meaning duty, but what is the purpose of the education? Women are still the homemakers once they get married, because they should be educated so that if anything befell their husband, then they could stand on their own 2 feet. And then he goes on to say, "I attended one of these speed dating events, and there were 35 girls and everything. And a lot of these girls were 31, 33. They've never been married or divorced. And a lot of them were doctors. And I just thought it's such a shame, because I wouldn't have the heart to say don't work. It would almost be an embarrassment. But you know, everyone else, I say, if you were that good at your job, then there'll always be time for it later." He was basically saying that women shouldn't kind of be placing any emphasis on their professional working lives, and that they should be housewives or be willing to give up their professional identities. He was a medical professional. He was in his late 30s, and he goes on to say, so he had a lot to say. He said, there are certain stages, this will, just wait for this one. He says, "There are certain stages in your life when you're ready for certain things, because I work in the medical field, and I know, and all the GPs will say the same, for a woman, her period of safely developing children is between 17 to 26. That's the most comfortable, safe period for her to have a child. After that age, your body starts to change, your biology starts to change, your pelvic girdle starts to stiffen, etc." So this was his justification for looking for a woman who was younger, at least 10 years younger than himself. I'll just read you another quote. I should really put these up on the slides, but another quote from another man. He said, "Women need to wake up. I think girls in the UK need to wake up." He was not British born, but he spoke to me anyway. "I think the girls in the UK need to wake up. They're gone over 30 and still dreaming, waiting for Mr. Perfect. I am good looking, accountancy qualified, house owner, British citizen, not born, 36 and divorced, no kids. Mum and dad lives with me. A lot of girls reject me for one of these reasons without even seeing me. They're looking for specs like buying a mobile. I'm going to Pakistan, inshallah, to get married because girls here are not serious about marriage. They need to be shown the reality. This will increase zina in Muslim girls and also lesbianism. I'm seeing a few Muslim girls going towards that if we don't do anything soon, because this is a basic instinct of all humans." So this is kind of quite typical of some of the comments that I get. I also get men who say that they can sort of pick and choose because there are plenty of fish in the sea. And that it's a buyer's market, so the comparison with the marketplace is quite profound. So anyway, going on to checklist mentalities and checklist obsessions, I mentioned before there is a kind of a real focus on ethnicity. This seems to be really important amongst certain families, whereas after 9/11, when a lot of us had a kind of a rethinking of our relationship to Islam, And there was an expectation or a thought even that British Muslims would be less ethnically inclined in terms of marital partners, and they'd be more open to marrying other Muslims of different ethnic backgrounds. What we're seeing actually is that that hasn't necessarily been the case. So while there have been more mixed ethnicity-based marriages, it's not to the extent that I would have expected. So there's quite a lot of focus on this, but it doesn't seem to kind of be an issue when there's white converts. So there are events that are catered for converts. And the interesting kind of dynamics of those are at convert events, there are barely any converts that turn up. It's mostly British-born Muslims of South Asian or Arab origin who are all looking for the white European. They're all looking for the Jemima Khan or the Hamza Yusuf. And they not quite kind of understanding that the reality of converts, in terms of demographics, is that most converts will either come from African Caribbean backgrounds or from other South Asian faiths or Southeast Asian faiths. So Hindu, Sikh or Buddhist. So they're not quite sort of geared up for what they see when they turn up to an event and find that maybe there's one or two Muslims who are reverts, who are converts, but they're not the kind of Muslim convert that they were expecting. And if there is a white woman, interestingly, all the sorts of issues around age, around status, that apply to women who are Muslim from Arab or Asian, South Asian backgrounds, tend to disappear. So men will queue up to talk to a white woman, regardless of her marital status or whether she has children. It's quite depressing to see. Again, age, as I've mentioned, is a real big issue. Looks is also very important, and we know this has always been an issue with arranged marriages in terms of complexion and whether someone is a wheatish complexion or a fair complexion. That all makes a difference, and whether someone looks like a model or not. Interestingly, when you go to the Arab events, or when I go to the Arab events, the women dress up a lot, and the men look like they've just come back from playing football. So these things make a difference. And again, just another anecdote. I was at one of these big free events where there are about 400 or 500 people, and a young man approached me and asked me for help in helping him find someone. He didn't want to use the app or anything like that. He just wanted to kind of scan the room and try and make a beeline for anyone that caught his eye. And I said, "So what are you looking for?" And he said, "Well, I like my food," and he liked his food. So he said, "I don't want someone who's really slim, because she will want me to diet and she won't let me eat as much as I like to eat. And I want someone who can enjoy my food with me. But I also have a particular thing." And I said, "What is it?" And he said, I don't want a woman whose eyebrows are arched. I want someone with straight eyebrows." So I spent a bizarre 15-20 minutes with this man walking around this packed hall looking for women and that he might be attracted to, but making sure that the eyebrows were of a certain kind with him. And do you know what he settled on? The girl that he made an actual beeline for at the end was the skinniest girl, and she was also a white convert. No, yes, yep. He didn't, so it just goes to show, he had, he didn't know what he wanted. But anyway, that's not unusual. That's the sad thing. We know that religious sect is an issue. So there's kind of no real kind of discussion that people would even have about marrying Sunni or Shia and vice versa. And we know that there's issues around people who maybe have genetic issues or genetic impairments within their families if they disclose, and some people don't disclose. We know that, we know that's a problem. So, special needs, mentioned, they have events for special needs, and, they don't have to happen enough, in my opinion. But there's a particular kind of disinclination to give anyone a chance if they happen to have an impairment of any kind. And again, there's an issue around status, and there's a search for these ideal types, even when people are looking at divorced and widowed events. So even when people are divorced and they're looking for someone, or they're open to someone who is divorced, men in particular will say they happy to marry someone who's divorced as long as she doesn't have children. or if she has children, they have to be really young, and the father, prefers that the father of those children is not on the scene, so they can be the one that is seen as the main father figure. So there's a kind of an issue around who you're looking for, even when there are certain things that are stacked against you. And then there's also this kind of issue of click. Everyone wants to have that click moment, that instant attraction, which is probably a kind of a throwback from Bollywood, and the kind of the romantic instant eye-catching moment. But people have forgotten that there is something to be had for the slow burner. When you get to know someone over a period of time, and people are not kind of giving people enough opportunity to get to know each other. They're not giving a chance to each other. So they basically are interested in instant click or instant attraction, again, to their detriment. The other issues, people, they understand. If I give a talk like this, I get lots of people coming up to me afterwards saying, yes, this is all kind of really sort of important, and you're so right to highlight all these issues, but they won't compromise on their own criteria. So it's okay to sort of agree with the theory and to agree with the findings and to know that there's a problem, but it's a problem for everyone else, but I'm still going to stick with my criteria. I'm not going to change. And there's an overemphasis, as I mentioned, placed on the first meeting. Again, another throwback probably to the arranged marriage introduction system, where if the first meeting was fine, then you could proceed to kind of seeing where things went in terms of the family, arranging other meetings. But it's a lot is placed on just that initial first meeting without kind of appreciating that people are nervous. People don't always necessarily present their best sides when they meet someone for the first time, especially when it's got a marriage angle attached to it. So as I mentioned, there's this kind of obsession with ideal types and these individualized responses, and not willing to consider people as a whole, including any baggage, in quotes, that they might have, i.e. children. So this checklist mentality is working against men and women also have these issues as well. So I speak to, again, lots of women who are in their 30s who will not consider a man who's divorced. They will not consider a man who's got children from a previous relationship because they don't think that they're mature enough to be able to handle being a stepmother. So they continue to sort of look for their perfect Mr. Prince person, but it's, again, not happening. And another thing that I've noticed is there's a fear of rejection. So a lot of people don't come to marriage events. A lot of people still stick to the online forum. And what that's about is, I think what's happened is some people are so fearful of rejection, they hide behind the computer. They hide behind the online persona because they are afraid of meetings and they're afraid of rejection and disappointment. And there is a whole process around going to an event and not coming back with anyone asking after you, or sending requests to meet people and having rejections constantly coming back. And there is an emotional trauma that is associated with that. The other thing that can happen, and that I've seen happen, is that people develop unhealthy attachments to people online or through phones and texts without meeting. People fall in love online and they've never met in person. So that in itself is quite unhealthy. And again, we've heard lots of horror stories about women who have developed a relationship with a man online and think they're going to get married because marriage has been talked about, and then find out that they get a phone call and it happens to be his wife, and he has 4 children, and he was basically just stringing her along. So we know that happens a lot, but we also know that people fall in love, and when they do meet, it becomes a big disappointment, and this just adds to their unwillingness to engage in the process of trying to find someone in any other way other than via online. And it's particularly if people don't look a certain way or they feel that they're not attractive enough. And as I mentioned sort of before, 2 minutes, okay. There are issues around behaviour and etiquette. So there are issues around players, which I've just sort of mentioned. These are men in terms of the married men, but there's also these men who have large numbers of female friends, and they're kind of seat fillers, basically. So there are men who kind of go around, they're very popular with the ladies. They're always seen as, the guy that everyone wants to marry, but they're not really serious about anyone in particular. There's a lot of sleazy online behaviour, and there's a lot of sleazy behaviour at events as well. There are also, as I mentioned, men and women who decide to walk out of a marriage event when they kind of scan the room and think there's no one good enough for them, or no one good looking enough for them, and the attitude of plenty more fish in the sea, and also someone better around the corner. So I think what's happening with the apps and with the increased choice is that it's making people think that if I kind of look a little bit harder, if I look a little bit more, I might find someone who is like maybe 85% compatible, whereas, you know, this person is probably 75% compatible. So they tend to have this attitude of someone better around the corner. They don't know when to stop. And there's also, in terms of another aspect of behaviour and etiquette, a lot of rudeness to marriage event organisers, men and women becoming quite abusive and quite rude, and physical abuse at some point as well. So just want to kind of end on some questions. Are our attitudes towards sex, and talking about sex, changing rather? Because there are so many coaches now, Muslim gurus or whatever, marriage gurus, relationship gurus, who are geared towards helping people find the one. You know, what is their success rate? We don't know. But it's good business, and a lot of people are charging a lot of money to come on these courses aimed at trying to help them find their partner. You know, do we need to kind of now think about how we broach the issue of marriage? Do we need to think about you know, talking about false expectations? Are these things, are these events, are these gurus, these relationship experts kind of giving false expectations, or are they helping single Muslims to readjust to their expectations? We also need to have these discussions around sexual needs and intimacy, because we don't have these discussions enough in our community, in Muslim communities. We need to be sort of being a little bit more aware of the impact that that celibacy is having on individuals, and it does have an impact, and it might be kind of really embarrassing or inappropriate for me to say that, but you know, I can see it in the sort of stories that people tell me, and in the sadness that they have about not being able to have that intimacy with someone, and the fact that some women and we know that men have sexual relationships outside marriage. But some women talk about this as well and think, well, maybe I should just, you know, I'm 40, maybe I should just get it over and done with, because sometimes I don't quite know what to do with myself and how I kind of contain myself or my emotions and my urges. And so I'm not saying that there's a lot of women who are walking around who are desperate, but they are kind of going through an issue. They are kind of having to work through a lot of emotional issues, and think about how they sort of manage their identities and as single women, and also the kind of sanctions and the kind of the kind of comments that get directed at them for being single at a certain age as well. So I think I'll stop at that point. I had lots more to kind of add to it, but thank you for listening, and